Good morning, everyone. Today, we're going to discuss with you the yeast dough bread production yeast. Bread can be a complex baked good to make, and it is important to know the basics of gluten development and yeast to make it correctly. Warm temperatures make yeast come alive, which will make them more active while baking. The longer you let them sit, the more your bread will rise. Gluten causes dough to become elastic and forms through kneading it. The stronger the gluten becomes, the more gas it holds. It is important for both gluten and yeast to make a good bread. There's a lot of choice when it comes to bakers' yeast. Active dry yeast, instant yeast, fresh yeast. It can be tricky to know which is the right one to use for what recipe. Here is what you need to know about different types of yeast for baking. But before we discuss the different types of yeast for baking, we define first what is yeast. Yeast is a single-cell living organism that acts as a leavening agent to make dough rise. It does this by consuming and converting sugars into carbon dioxide, which produces the bubbles in the dough that make it expand or rise, as it proofs in a warm, moist environment, and again as it bakes in a hot oven. No matter what form your yeast comes in, active dry yeast, instant, or fresh yeast, it needs to multiply and grow in a systematic environment. The correct environment includes moisture, food, and a warm, nurturing temperature. Here's the three types of yeast for baking. The first type is fresh yeast. Fresh yeast, also known as compressed or cake yeast, is active yeast. It's sold in tiny cakes in the refrigerated section of many supermarkets. Fresh yeast does not keep well. It will last about 2 weeks if refrigerated. The yeast should be pale gray, brown, fragrant, soft, and crumbly, not hard, dark brown, or crusty. Any mold growing on the surface is an indication that the yeast should be discarded. Fresh yeast should be soaked in tepid water without contact with salt or sugar. This yeast type is a good choice for breads requiring a long cold rise, or for breads made using the sponge method. The second one is active dry yeast. Active dry yeast is the most commonly available form for home bakers and is available in 1/4 ounce packets or jars. The yeast is dormant. It needs to be rehydrated and proofed before using. Dry yeast should be stored in a cold, dry place, but do not use it after the expiration date on the package. Store open containers in the refrigerator. The last one is the instant yeast. Instant yeast is a dry yeast that comes in smaller granules than active dry yeast, absorbs liquid rapidly, and does not need to be rehydrated or proofed before being mixed into flour. Bread machine yeast and rapid rise yeast are instant yeast that may include ascorbic acid, a dough conditioner. Bread machine yeast is an instant yeast specially formulated for use in a bread machine. Again, store the yeast in a cold dry place or in the refrigerator once the package has been opened. Do not use yeast after the expiration date. Yeast bread basic. All yeast breads must contain flour, liquid, salt, and yeast. Many recipes also include sugar, fat, and eggs. You can also use all-purpose flour for making yeast breads. However, many yeast bread recipes call for bread flour. Bread flour contains more gluten than all-purpose flour. When mixed with liquid and kneaded, the flour develops gluten, which supports the carbon dioxide produced by the yeast.
Next, liquids in yeast bread. You can use plain water, potato water, or milk as the liquid in yeast bread. You must warm all liquids to activate the yeast. Milk adds nutrients to bread and helps bread stay fresher longer. It also gives bread a softer crust. Then some yeast bread recipes state that you should scald the milk first. But this step is unnecessary if you are using pasteurized milk. Then next, the temperatures. If you will be dissolving the yeast in a water, you must need to heat the liquids to 105 degrees or 115 degrees. If you are combining yeast with other dry ingredients, you must heat the liquids to 120 degrees or 130 degrees. Temperatures that are too high will kill the yeast cells. Then temperatures that are too low can slow or stop the yeast activity. When preparing bread in a bread machine, liquids should be at a room temperature like 75 degrees or 85 degrees. The next, salt in yeast bread. Salt regulates the action of the yeast and inhibits the action of certain enzymes in the flour. And salt adds flavor in a yeast bread. Without salt, a yeast dough is sticky and hard to handle. We have here steps in yeast production. First is scaling. Scaling is the exact measurement of all ingredients. Professional bakers and dedicated amateurs measure by weight. And the French term "mise en plat" applies to having all the ingredients scaled or prepared and ready before starting production. Next is mixing. Mixing involves the incorporation by hand or by machine of the ingredients in proper sequence to form the bread dough, which is then further kneaded. Kneading or working the dough by hand or by machine further disperses the ingredients and develops the gluten in the dough. Third is the fermentation. Fermentation, also referred to as the first rise, the process whereby the gluten in the dough is allowed to relax while the yeast grows and reproduces. The yeast digests the sugars in the flour and produce alcohol and carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide gets trapped in the packets that results from the kneading process and causes the bread to expand or rise and develop flavor. At this point, the dough can be left at room temperature if it is to be baked that day, or it can be retarded. That is, the fermentation period can be extended in a cool environment. Usually, a specialized refrigerator, dough that have been retarded for 12 to 24 hours generally have more complex flavors and are easier to fit into the baker's production schedule. There is also a noticeable buildup of natural acidity, which helps extend shelf life. Next, punching. Punching down the dough, also called turning, refers to the general deflating of the dough mass by either gently pushing down or folding the dough, not heating it as implied. The purpose is to fold, to increase the strength and tolerance of the gluten and to degas the dough prior to scaling. After punching, the dough is allowed to rest before moving on the next step. Next step is scaling. Scaling is cutting and weighing individual pieces of dough, which will become the actual loaves of bread. Then the next one is rounding. Rounding occurs once the dough has been scaled. Each piece is gently shaped into a round ball before moving on to next step. This rounding allows uniformity in subsequent steps. The next step, pinching. Benching is allowing the dough pieces to rest, usually for 15 to 20 minutes. The time varies with each type of bread. Each type of bread and with the amount of leavening used. Clean dry towels placed over the dough during this period prevent a dry crust from forming in the dough. Then next is make up and panning. Make up is forming the individual pieces of dough into their final shapes. Free form loaf, pan loaf, dinner loaf, out dinner rolls, and so forth. Then next is proofing, also referred to as the final rise. Allows the dough to rise one last time before baking. The yeast is still alive and continues to live in the dough. Proofing generally takes place in a warm, draft-free environment, either at room temperature or in a proof box, where temperatures and humidity are controlled. At this point, shaped loaves can be retarded for 12 to 24 hours and baked at a later time. The next is baking. Baking is the actual cooking of the bread. When the dough is put in the hot oven, it undergoes oven spring, one last push of the yeast to make the dough rise. The actual temperature and time depend on the oven type. For example, the rotary, convection, rack, and so forth. And the use of steam, although yeast breads are generally baked at a high temperature. Technically speaking, this is when the starches gelatinize and sugars caramelize, giving the loaf its final appearance. Then next is cooling. Cooling begins when the finished bread is removed from the oven. The bread cools completely before it is packaged or sliced. Cooling racks are usually nothing more than wire shelves that allow air circulation on all four sides of the bread. Even breads baked in or on pans are quickly removed to a cooling rack to the bread bottoms do not become soggy from continued steaming. Then the last one is storing. Storing prevents the staling or starch retrogradation that begins as soon as the bread is removed from the oven. To preserve their thin, crisp crust, some breads are best not packaged, but modern baking and distribution practices requires many bakers to do so. Once a loaf has been put into a bag, the staling process is somewhat slowed down and the crust becomes soft. Wrapping and freezing help maintain quality for a longer period of time. Then refrigeration, on the other hand, speeds up staling. Action requires proper mixing and careful preparation. A baker must learn to avoid common causes of failure when preparing yeast breads. Next, mixing method for yeast bread. First is the traditional method. You can use the traditional method to prepare refrigerator yeast breads. These breads often call for extra yeast, sugar, and salt. Mix and knead the dough and place in a covered bowl in the refrigerator. Shape the dough and bake it the next day. This is sometimes called the cool rice method. The steps in traditional method: soften the yeast in warm water, 105 degrees or 115 degrees. Add the sugar, fat, and salt to the milk. The milk should be room temperature to lukewarm. Combine the yeast with the liquid mixture and add some of the flour. Beat the mixture until smooth. Add the remaining flour gradually to form a dough. And second is one rice method. Mix ingredients, knead, and let rest for a few minutes. Shape dough, then allow to rise before baking. Then the next one is the mixing method, mixture method. This method works well with active dry or fast rising yeast. It also allows ingredients to blend easily and eliminates softening the yeast. The steps in mixture method: mix the yeast with some of the flour and all of the other dry ingredients. Heat the liquid and fat together to a temperature of 120 degrees or 130 degrees, and add to the dry ingredients with an electric mixer. Add eggs if required, and add the remaining flour to form a dough. Using the mixture helps develop the gluten and shortens the kneading time. Then the next one is the butter method. Uses less flour, so the yeast mixture is thinner than a dough. Vigorous stirring rather than kneading helps develop the gluten. If the recipe requires 2 risings, rise first in the mixing bowl, then spread the butter in the baking pan for the second rising. Then the next one is the cool rice dough. Prepared from recipes that are especially designed to rise slowly in the refrigerator, mix the ingredients and knead the dough. Then after a brief rest, you shape the dough and place it in a pan. Cover and refrigerate. The dough will rise and be ready to bake 24 hours later. Then the next one is the refrigerator dough. Prepared from recipes that are especially designed to rise slowly in the refrigerator, often uses to the butter method. Shaped after refrigeration, dough can remain in the refrigerator for 2 to 24 hours. Then you shape the dough, let it rise, and bake it. Then the next one is the freezer method. Recipes allow you to mix and knead the dough. Then you can freeze the dough before or after shaping. Store the dough in the freezer for up to 1 month. When you are ready to eat it, thaw, shape if necessary, let rise and bake. Then the last one is the bread machines. Fastest, easiest way to produce homemade bread. Each machine model behaves differently. Carefully follow the manufacturer's directions. You can check the temperature of the dough by opening the machine's lid partway through the first knead cycle. The dough should form a soft ball that is somewhat sticky to the touch. If the dough is too moist, the loaf will collapse during baking. To correct, add 1 tablespoon of bread flour at a time. Weather conditions have an effect on dough prepared in a bread machine. That's all. Thank you for listening.